Do you feel that it was less dodged that time?
Yes, I do feel like it was less dodged. Although, I mean, the point still remains, I guess, that you receive the racial groups as the best groups to be using as metrics in public policy.
I didn't say that. I've never said that.
I don't think I've heard Jamel say that either.
I've said that when addressing racial inequality, we should address racial inequality. That's my claim.
The best way to fight racial inequality is to fight racial inequality. It's so simple. Why are you stupid, Coleman? Why don't you understand this?
Coleman mentioned the idea of an adversity score, something I don't disagree with whatsoever. But it does seem funny to me, right, that like we can think of all of these ways to create proxies for disadvantage instead of just saying straightforwardly, yeah, like the descendants of enslaved Black Americans, the descendants of people who were affected by Jim Crow, they face a particularized situation, and we just need to like deal with that. That seems to me much more honest and straightforward.
It's so funny because it's like literally the opposite. So under that framework, if you had someone who's Black, who's the descendants of slaves, and they are a millionaire, okay? Do they get some magical benefit from whatever program you're talking about?
You're right.
Just because they're Black and descended from slaves? Or is that kind of fucking retarded?
You're totally right.
Like, I don't like, this is why this is like this, it's insane because he's making like a weird race essentialism argument. Like I don't think he means
if you're the descendant of slaves that you have to be poor. That's the argument that he's
making. Well, because it's like, well, no, because it's being the descendant, unless he's listen, maybe he's a very religious man and he's making some kind of argument about the soul of Black folks, okay? You know, being passed down from generation to generation. Like, just because you've descended from someone who was systemically oppressed by society, okay? Yeah, that's going to mean that's going to mean it's harder for you to succeed because of a million reasons, which we all understand intuitively. But if that person's succeeded, right? Why would you base a system around that metric? Why would you base like, what is the benefit? And he says it's more open and honest, but it's not. Why are you like, unless it's just like an emotional thing. Like, it's kind of like, I just want to be acknowledged. Maybe that's what it is. I just want to be acknowledged for the oppression of my ancestors, which maybe it's all it is. It's just a complete emotional argument. They just want, he just wants an acknowledgement or something, because the millionaire who's descended from slaves should not get government assistance for any reason. They're a millionaire. They don't need it. Right. But if there's a Black person who, let's say their family moved to America after the Civil Rights Movement in 1970s, okay, and they're poor, why should they not have the same access to any sort of programs that would help poor people just because they're not descended from slaves?
Well, then his entire worldview falls apart. So that's the problem here. He's trying to maintain this worldview that the struggle of slavery tangibly affected everyone in ways that can never be forgiven or looked past.
But even if it has, it's still stupid, because it's like the argument, and this is like the crux of why their argument is really dumb. Okay. Mm-hmm. If you remove racism, intentional racism from the laws, okay, you throw it away, throw it in the trash can, and you remove intentional racism from society, which they're all basically saying that it is gone for the most part. They all want to make this sort of systemic racist argument.
Right. So the secret racism.
The secret ghost racism that no one can see. The racism in the machine, right? Exactly. Okay. If you're going to, if that's the argument you're going to make, then you say, well, then you can't argue against what Coleman said, because then race is irrelevant. It's just that, yeah, maybe race put people in those situations in the first place, but the race isn't the factor anymore. It's that race put the family, because of redlining or because of Jim Crow or because of whatever, put the family in the position to be lower economic status.
Right.
And so why, at that point, race is a proxy for the actual issue, which is socioeconomic status or class or resources or whatever you want to, use. Race is just a proxy. But only in that
particular situation.
Right. And you don't just get to hand wave it away and say, well, it's more honest. That doesn't mean anything. It's not more honest.
Right.
It's only more honest if you think everyone's still walking around being racist.
In dealing with problems of inequality, then what to my mind is just talking around it and finding ways to talk around it.
I want to say I feel Jamel slightly dodged Thomas's point.
Oh, got him, ba.
His point being that race conscious policy, race as a variable, runs roughshod over many of the important distinctions, such as whether you're a descendant of slaves, where you're from, your group level income. Nigerian Americans, much higher income than Black Americans descended from slaves. And yet all of the race-based policies by definition lump them together, while at the same time claiming that they are trying to address those sub-variables that they are running roughshod over. And that is one reason why that's one reason why I'm in favor. I'm hardly against policies that are meant to curb disadvantage, but to use race as a proxy for it is just choosing to use a worse, less precise proxy when there are better, more precise ones available.
See, this is why I do think that there's racism going on. Race, specifically racism against white people, because that's what they're trying to avoid. They're like, we don't want to give money to poor whites who are racists. That's exactly what they're trying to avoid.
I don't know if it's so much we don't want to give money to the poor white people who we think are racist. It's more like they do believe, people that advocate for this do believe that poor white people have some sort of lower moral quality or lower moral weight to them because they were granted magical white privilege and they still haven't been able to succeed. And so Black people who are poor are more deserving of it because, they had more, hoops and hurdles to kind of go through and get over.
All of this is from a really screwed up worldview.
I agree.
This whole white privilege worldview.
Yes.
Toxic.
Yeah, of course.
Toxic. It leads you to all these assumptions that are just, oh man. You shouldn't be making these assumptions. Yeah.
Yes.
So bad. Coleman's sitting here like, but don't you understand? We could just give money to poor people. And he's thinking, no, damn it. Not going to give money to those poor white racists.
Right.
But he can't come out and say that, right?
No.
He's got to say, oh, the systemic inequality that goes back to the slavery age.
I don't know if it's that they're racist or that they're, they don't deserve it. Black people deserve it, but white people don't deserve it.
Right. Well, yeah, there is that. There is that differentiation.
Mm-hmm.
So two things. The first is if Coleman feels that I'm dodging the question, then to address it more head on, then part of the issue is that affirmative action programs happen in the context prior to this previous Supreme Court decision, Milliken v. Bradley in 1973, 74, which basically ruled out the possibility of using college admissions or anything as a kind of recompense or directly touching the question of racial inequality. The Supreme Court said you can only consider diversity, right? So in that context, yeah, that critique is totally right. It's a critique I've made myself, that affirmative action policies don't actually, they're too race consciousness in that manner under those circumstances doesn't address the direct question of inequality. It touches it, but doesn't address it directly. You can imagine a world, let's say a Fortas doesn't leave the court and all of a sudden the composition of the court is a little different. And the court says, no, you can consider past racial inequality directly in terms of doing college admissions. In that case, is that a proxy? No, that's just directly touching the thing. And so I think it's...
Well, no, okay, this is so stupid. It's a proxy unless your argument is that there's some magic. Okay. I know how everyone on the stream loves magic so much.
Oh,
unless unless there's some magic, that there's a magical quality to slavery and a magical quality to Jim Crow, and this undefinable magical etherical quality is just passed down through Black people that we don't know and we can't explain. It's very spooky, passes down from, slave to descendant to descendant to descendant to, person who's Black living in 2023. And they are imbued with this evil magical quality that makes them perform worse in society, right? Unless that's your argument, what he's saying makes no sense, because then being the descendant of slavery still is a proxy. It's a proxy for something else. Unless he's saying that the intrinsic quality of being a descendant of a slave somehow makes you not able to perform in society today to the same level as everyone else.
It's fundamentally, it's a reparations argument. It's saying they were disadvantaged by slavery, and therefore you're going to try to atone for that disadvantage that their ancestors had.
Maybe. I don't know.
Well, the thing is,
could be
though,
part of it, yeah.
The thing is, obviously, if Oprah Winfrey's a descendant of slaves, and that's the rub, right?
Right.
Because there are
listen,
people that were experienced that disadvantage, but then fortune shined on them.
Right.
They're no longer disadvantaged. Yeah.
Yeah, but so does Oprah Winfrey, because she has the magical intrinsic quality of being a descendant of slave, should she benefit from some kind of specific government policy?
Well, I do think people are going to be very upset about it if that's the situation.
Well, but that's what he's advocating for.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the question.
I get it.
That's the question I ask him to say, okay, if Oprah Winfrey is the descendant of a slave, does she get whatever magical race-based benefit that you want to confer specifically to Black descendants of slaves?
Right.
Because if he says no, then you say, well, why not? And if you say, well, it's because she's rich, well, because then it means there's a fucking proxy for being rich, doesn't it?
Yeah, you're using class as a proxy as well. Yeah.
Yes. And it's funny because he was complaining. He's like, I agree that the affirmative action thing was wrong from originally. But what he said, if you're really paying attention very closely, he didn't really explain it. So you have to kind of understand what he's referencing. What he's saying is he was against the original affirmative action, not because he's against affirmative action or the idea of affirmative action helping Black people. He was against affirmative action because in the original case, it said affirmative action could only exist not because it's helping Black people, but because having diversity in the classroom would confer some kind of benefit to every student in the classroom.
Yeah, we went through that on another live stream, which is
right when we talked about
a crazy argumentation. Yeah,
right, which is kind of why I don't understand why people were not saying that affirmative action was always built upon very shaky legal ground in the first place. Right, that's to me a very difficult argument to defend.
We should just lay out the defense real quick for people who might not have listened to that live stream, because it is kind of interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
So in the original affirmative action case, I don't remember what year it was, but it was the case that stipulated that having specific racial quotas was illegal.
Right. Because it's racism.
Right. The court did acknowledge that having government policies or even private policies, private colleges, having policies where they use race as a factor, it acknowledged that was literally unconstitutional.
Right.
Okay, it acknowledged that. But it said under strict scrutiny, which means that's when you can do something that's technically unconstitutional. Right. Yeah. You can do something that's unconstitutional or illegal as long as you have a really good reason for it, or the government can, I guess I should say. The government
you gotta love it.
And it said, okay, so it is technically illegal and unconstitutional, but we have a really good reason.
Right.
And
what's the really good reason, Sitch?
Well, that was the problem. The ruling specifically said the really good reason was not that Black people, because of the history of slavery and Jim Crow, needed a leg up. It specifically said that was not the reason. And the argument it gave was, if you did that, you would have a continuing sliding scale of oppressed classes that get special benefits from the government. And then as soon as they like reached some standard or eclipse the majority group, then you'd have to change all the laws to kind of rebalance things out.
Right.
And so I was saying that's not the reason. I was saying saying that the reason that the government could basically break the law was because diversity, because having diverse population at a college conferred some kind of educational benefit to every student at the college, regardless of whether they were white or black or Asian or whatever. Which, I mean, I guess that could in theory be true. I don't necessarily think it's like 100% untrue, but I have no fucking clue how you'd prove that in a court of law. It'd be a very difficult thing to prove factually, substantively.
Right.
And
you get
so
the experience of all these different races.
Right. Yeah.
Which is they're all operating under an American ethnicity. It's like, who cares?
Right. It was the idea that, you know, if you're white and you go to a college and it has an ethnically diverse student body, you would end up having a better education because of that.
Right.
Which, I mean, on a philosophical level, I mean, I don't necessarily disagree with that, but I don't know if you could construct a law around that.
Right.
So
I've made this point. I really think, and this is why I've been trying to really focus on this question of group inequality, because once we get into this stuff, now we're thinking about the legal architecture here. And the legal architecture is in fact informed by these debates about what constitutes colorblindness, what constitutes race consciousness. And I think that when we're talking about affirmative action in college admissions in 2023, pre this ruling, we do have to take note of the fact that the court essentially set up a situation that would produce the outcome that Thomas was describing in his question.
Coleman, do you feel that it was less dodged that time?
no.
Yes, I do feel like it was less dodged.
Wow.
Although, I mean, the point still remains, I guess, that you receive the racial groups as the best groups to be using as metrics in public policy.
I didn't say that. I've never said
Yeah,
that.
I don't think I've heard Jamel say that either.
I've said that when
fair
addressing
enough.
racial inequality, we should address racial inequality. That's my claim.
Whoa. Wait a minute. That is some sneaky bullshit. Okay, wait a minute. Let's
How
go
do you
back.
not address the race?
Wait a minute.
If that's
We're at
your claim.
5946. Okay. We need to go back. We need to go back in time here. See what was specifically said.
I feel Jamel slightly dodged Thomas's point, his point being that race conscious policy, race as a variable, runs roughshod over many of the important distinctions, such as whether you're a descendant of slaves, where you're from, your group level income. Nigerian Americans, much higher income than Black Americans descended from slaves. And yet all of the race-based policies by definition lump them together, while at the same time claiming that they are trying to address those sub-variables that they are running roughshod over. And that is one reason why that's one reason why I'm in favor. I'm hardly against policies that are meant to curb disadvantage, but to use race as a proxy for it is just choosing to use a worse, less precise proxy when there are better, more precise ones available.
So two things. The first is if Coleman feels that I'm dodging the question, then to address it more head on, then part of the issue is that affirmative action programs happen in the context prior to this previous Supreme Court decision, Milliken v. Bradley in 1973, 74, which basically ruled out the possibility of using college admissions or anything as a kind of recompense or directly touching the question of racial inequality. The Supreme Court said you can only consider diversity, right? So in that context, yeah, that critique is totally right. It's a critique I've made myself, that affirmative action policies don't actually, they're too race consciousness in that manner under those circumstances doesn't address the direct question of inequality. It touches it, but doesn't address it directly. You can imagine a world, let's say Abe Fortas doesn't leave the court and all of a sudden the composition of the court is a little different. And the court says, no, you can consider past racial inequality directly in terms of doing court and all address the direct question of inequality. It touches it, but doesn't address diversity, right? So in that context, yeah, that critique is totally right. It's a critique I've made myself, that affirmative action policies don't actually, they're too race consciousness in that manner under those circumstances doesn't address the direct question of inequality. It touches it, but doesn't address.
He switches from reparations to inequality here. I don't know.
Yeah,
if
he
you
says
caught that.
doesn't. So, okay. So he specifically says doesn't address inequality.
But
Okay.
before he said it doesn't address reparations, which I'm just, in the case of the Oprah Winfrey situation, you would owe her reparations.
Did he say the word reparation?
Well, he said recompense,
For
which is from, I would assume, compensation.
Diversity, right? So
this is why it's so annoying, because he speaks so unclearly.
in that context, yeah, that critique is totally right. It's a critique I've made myself, that affirmative action policies don't actually, they're too race consciousness in that manner under those circumstances doesn't address the direct question of inequality. It touches it, but doesn't address it directly. You can imagine a world, let's say Abe Fortas doesn't leave the court and all of a sudden the composition of the court is a little different, and the court says, no, you can consider past racial inequality directly in terms of doing college admissions. In that case, is that a proxy? No, that's just directly touching the thing. And so I think I've made this point before, but I really think, and this is why I've been trying to really focus on this question of group inequality, because once we get into this stuff, now we're thinking about the legal architecture here. And the legal architecture is in fact informed by these debates about what constitutes colorblindness, what constitutes race consciousness. And I think that when we're talking about affirmative action college admissions in 2023, pre this ruling, we do have to take note of the fact that the court essentially set up a situation that would produce the outcome that Thomas was describing in his question.
Okay, so Coleman said in his question, or about the Dodge, he said, if we're trying to curb disadvantage, we shouldn't be using race as a proxy. Okay, that was
Right.
that was the core of his statement. He did allow wiggle room for a bad actor to sort of hyperfixate on slavery specifically. But Bowie specifically says that the type of race conscious policy that the current affirmative action, or I should say the previous affirmative action allowed, did not address inequality. He didn't say did not address, the slavery specifically. He said inequality broadly.
Okay. True.
Coleman, do you feel that it was less dodged that time?
Yes, I do feel like it was less dodged. Although, I mean, the point still remains, I guess, that you receive the racial groups as the best groups to be using as metrics in public policy.
I didn't say that. I've never said
Yeah,
that.
I don't think I've heard Jamel say that either.
I've said that when
fair enough.
addressing racial inequality, we should address racial inequality. That's my claim.
Okay, so this is why I'm saying he's being kind of sneaky, or at least he's, if I'm going to be charitable here, he's very shitty in how he speaks and very imprecise in how he speaks. Because obviously, if you're not retarded, and Coleman Hughes asks you that question about if your goal is to curb disadvantage, why are we using race as a proxy? Okay. Obviously, if you're a human that understands English, the question is not about specifically curbing racial disadvantage. It's saying if you're trying to curb disadvantage in our society broadly, overall, why are you using race as a proxy? And so therefore, when you're answering that question and you say such and such doesn't address inequality, and you don't say racial inequality, you just say inequality, how else are you supposed to interpret that answer?
You tell me.
You're supposed to interpret that he's talking about the same level of inequality that the Coleman Hughes is talking about. So Coleman is actually completely correct to say, well, why are you're saying that everything has to go down to race. You're saying race is the best proxy. And he's saying, no, I didn't say race is the best proxy. I said race is the best proxy when talking about racial inequality. What's a fucking retarded statement? Because the entire argument is about, well, what causes racial inequality? Is racial inequality because of race, or is it because of other factors? That's the entire argument. So for him to play this game and say, well, I didn't say that. I just said this very simple tautology that's so stupid I would never actually utter it in a conversation. Why would you ever say the best thing to measure racial inequality is to measure race inequality? Why would anyone say those words?
Yeah, it's a total tautology. I don't know what he's getting at. Why he's like,
Look,
if he's not acknowledging, if he's saying, look, I'm not saying we should look at race, but we have to deal with racial. Like, what is he saying to look at then?
So, okay.
Why does he keep saying? Coleman's calling him out. Why is he? What is he pivoting to?
So, Coleman said, "Why are you using race as a proxy?"
Right.
And Bowie didn't answer the question, except to say that there's some sort of magical intrinsic property to being a slave, whatever that means. So then Coleman correctly says,
receive the racial groups as the best groups to be using as metrics in public policy.
I didn't say that.
So he's saying, so actually you could correct it and say, well, he didn't actually say race was. He said whether you have slaves as an ancestor.
Yeah, he's talking about, that's why he uses the word recompense.
Yes.
Because he's talking about reparations.
Right. And so you could say, so if Bowie could say, well, I didn't say race, I said ancestry. But then it's like, well, why does that matter? Why is that the best thing?
I've never said that.
I don't think I've heard Jamel say that either.
I've said that when addressing
So,
racial inequality, we should address racial inequality.
Yeah, but see, this is why that's a
It's so stupid though, because
That's
you can have racial inequality because an immigrant comes over and has no money.
Yes. So, but that's why he's being kind of dishonest in his framing here, because he didn't say, well, I didn't say race, I said ancestry, which was his argument. And you could make some, and there is a reason why you want to differentiate that. But he doesn't. He just said, oh, the best way to fight racial inequality is to fight racial inequality. It's so simple. Why are you stupid, Coleman? Why don't you understand this?
The question forces him to differentiate it because the guy so clearly said, listen, you're concocting all of these policies that are literally helping Black immigrants over descendants of slaves.
Right.
You're moving further away from the whole reason for the policy.
Right.
Hi, you just listened to a clip from the Sitch and Adams show. If you like what you heard, you can listen to our live show right here on this channel on Sunday, starting at 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern. And if you want, you can super chat us. We read $20 and up super chats on the show and then do a follow-up stream on the following Tuesday where we read the rest of the unread super chats and interact with fans of the show. Subscribe to this channel right here to listen to the live show or to listen to more of our awesome clips.